Well, good morning to you all. Thank you for the invitation to moderate this panel on Mexico's power market. My name is Nicholas Borda, and I'm a partner with the law firm Haynes & Boone. I'm based in Mexico City. And it is my pleasure to introduce this panel where we're going to be discussing the current conditions of the electricity sector in Mexico. And we'll also be discussing how this electricity market will be developing. This is a unique panel in the sense that we have three specialists here that will focus on different perspectives: legal, regulatory, public policy, financial, and business perspectives. The timing of this panel is also unique, as you heard from Mr. Secretary Pedro Joaquin Colwell, because this week, SENACE took the offers for this second long-term auction. CFE acquired from private parties capacity, energy, and clean energy certificates, cells, and investments are north of $3 billion for this second long-term auction. And CFE acquired about 1,483 megawatts of capacity, 10 million megawatts of energy, and also 10 million cells. So let me introduce, you have on your tables a short version of the summary on the bios of each of my panelists here. So I won't go into details, but first we will hear from Juan Rosellón, who is with CIDE, and also he's an independent board member of SENACE, who is the independent system operator of the National Electric Grid and also in charge of the electricity market and dispatching electricity. Then we will hear from my colleague Tom Heather, who's a counsel in our Mexico City office. And last but not least, we will hear from Jose Antonio Aguilar, chairman and principal of Vive Energía. Jose Antonio was successful to sell electricity in the first, he sold energy in the first long-term auction, and now he sold capacity in the second long-term auction. So we will take questions at the end of this panel. So the format will be, you can just line up here on the mics. I think there's one mic here, and there should be another one over there. But if not, please make a line at the end. So the format will be, each of them will give a short 5-minute presentation, not more than 5. And then we will have a discussion among ourselves. And then at the end, we'll open for questions from the audience. Thanks again for being here. And Juan Rosellón, please come to the podium. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm really glad to be back to RISE after some years of having started here. And I would like to present, after many years of being researching and teaching issues related to market reform, market design, architecture of markets, from an economics point of view, from a regulatory economics point of view, my assessment, I would say, of the reform of the electricity sector in Mexico. So, I will basically, during this first intervention, tell you about my view on the new industry and institutional structure, and in the questions I will address other more detailed issues. But then I would like to go to the description of the reform. As I said, after many years of been teaching regulatory economics and researching on market design issues, I would say that this reform would be kind of in the middle of a completely closed industrial organization structure and a completely open. So the Mexican reform is basically opening its generation sector to the intervention of new private generators. And the idea is that CFE plants, subsidiaries, generation plants, will keep operating in the market. And the idea is that there is a horizontal separation of these plants and that there is a level playing field for the new generators. So that's one of, I would say, one of the main changes. But CFE remains in the ownership of transmission and distribution lines, with the possibility of subcontracting to private investors the building or the operation of the new transmission lines. And also CFE remains as the only, or basically the main supplier for basic service users. However, there is this view that retailers will be arbitrating, will be competing both in the market for large users and basic service users in order to deal with the potential threat that CFE could carry out cross-subsidization between the two markets. And the other big change that I can see in this reform is, of course, the new system operator. Well, SENACE was before within CFE, but now it's an independent system operator. That's not so trivial because not all markets that liberalize go for an independent system operator. Like in Europe, we see TSOs, transmission system operators, that carry out both the ownership of the transmission lines and system operation. But here we decided in Mexico to carry out this independency of the system operator. And I would say that this is also one of the main issues regarding the new industry structure. As the Secretary was mentioning, although this is, I would say, something in between a completely closed structure and a completely open structure, this means also an energy revolution, as the Secretary was mentioning, because this is the first time we're having direct exchange commercial exchange between producers and large users in Mexico. So just very briefly, I think the main challenges here are, of course, this issue of trying to set up a new market under the existence of an already dominant incumbent, which is, of course, CFE. So horizontal unbundling in generation is really crucial, as well as vertical unbundling to deal with open access issues regarding access to the transmission lines. And likewise, this issue of potential cross-subsidization between the market of small consumers to large consumers. So the retailer or marketing activities are really important. And also something which is related to my area of academic research is the way the authorities are looking into the evolution or expansion of the transmission network, which is also something really important. So they are basically having two ways to address this issue. One is through planning that is carried out in a combination of CENER making forecasts of the generation that is going to be needed in the country, and then SENACE, the system operator, carries out the planning of expanding the network using a regular power flow model with its regular power flow constraints. And after that, the CRE is supposed to regulate transmission tariffs. That's something I would like to comment afterwards, because I think there is some work that needs to be done there. And before I forget, and we will have time to address this later, but another interesting thing of this reform is that we are following this vision of developing the clean energy sources, which include not only renewable sources, so the definition of clean energy in Mexico is broader than just renewable energy. The way we're planning to develop it, to develop this market is through not using any like tax or feed-in tariff structure, but we are using this market for clean energy certificates. So from an economics point of view, theoretical economics point of view, it's very interesting how we're dealing with that, and we have seen during the first auctions for clean energy that it's evolving in a successful way, I would say. So probably I should stop here, Nicolas. And
Thank you. You had 30 seconds, but that's perfect. Okay, so now, Tom Heather, if you can please come to the podium and give us your 5-minute presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas. Good morning, everybody. The reform to the power industry must be seen as a key component of the energy reform as a whole. The purpose, in a nutshell, of the electricity reform is to bring down the cost of power for domestic consumers as well as for large-scale consumers such as industry. And in order to achieve that, that must be tied to the hydrocarbons reform, where the production of hydrocarbons, in this case natural gas, must be increased and stimulated, along with facilitating imports of natural gas, in which Texas is a key player. Since Mexico imports over 50% of its natural gas, and the vast majority of power plants in Mexico are combined cycle. So there is a need for natural gas. So by lowering production costs of hydrocarbons and making them more readily available, and developing natural gas, transportation, and storage infrastructure to feed these power plants, it is expected that, tied to the creation of a competitive electricity market where private participants are on a level playing field with where they're in a level playing field with CFE and eventually its productive subsidiaries, the cost of electricity will come down for both consumers and large scale industry. The electricity reform has three key components. One of them is the creation of a fully competitive electricity market. The other one is the restructuring of the CFE. That's some bundling, the creation of independent subsidiaries for each type of activity, whether it's transmission, distribution, generation, commercialization, qualified supply, or supply to domestic users. Prior to the energy reform, the private sector was able to participate in the power sector through the following schemes, which are shown in the graph above. Independent power production projects, small generation, import and export of electricity, and self-supply, which has been a very popular and widely used means to supply power to industrial and large-scale consumers. With the energy reform, the private sector may now participate in the generation of power, in its marketing, and in trading activities, whereas transmission and distribution are still considered public services which are reserved to the state. But as Dr. Rosellón mentioned, the private sector may participate in these projects under contractual agreements or in financing schemes. So we are seeing a large-scale change in the power industry, which has often been opaqued by the reform in hydrocarbons, but this is nonetheless an important change, and as I mentioned, must be seen in conjunction with the hydrocarbons reform in the energy reform as a whole. With respect to the restructuring of CFE, its unbundling is mandated by statute, and new subsidiaries have been created, 6 generation subsidiaries, then 1 transmission and 1 distribution subsidiary, and 1 for basic supply. And a subsidiary for qualified supply is yet to be created. And then 2 trading affiliates have also been created, 1 here in the US, CFE International, which is organized under Delaware law, and CFE Energy in Mexico, which is primarily responsible for the purchase and trading of natural gas to fuel combined cycle power plants. And we'll go into further detail in these topics during the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Now it is José Antonio Aguilar who will give us his 5-minute presentation. Please, José Antonio.
First of all, thank you to the Baker Institute and Rice University and to Heinz and Boone for the invitation to join you today. It's a great honor. Thank you. And I didn't bring a presentation because I always consider that a conversation tends to be more revealing, not probably making a presentation, but that's my style, I guess. Anyways, I don't have a 5-minute presentation to deal with you. I just want to say that as a market participant, we have seen and we have experienced already the benefits of the reform. We are a company that has, in the past, win, as Nicolas was mentioning, one of the bids for selling electricity and energy and sales in the first round of the auction, and then we sold, or we're planning to sell capacity in the second round. In the second auction, we were awarded 30 megawatts of capacity, which by itself tends to be it's a benefit, but it's a challenge because, as you know, we're dealing with a renewable energy, and that can be sometimes tricky. And we can discuss that further down as how the financing comes about when you're selling capacity from a renewable plant, because it's not easy. There are real challenges, especially by the way this capacity is going to be defined under the rules of the energy market. That was a very tough definition, Dr. Rosellón. I don't know if that was your idea as to how to design the way to define what capacity means in the energy market in Mexico going forward. Anyways, probably some comments also as well regarding the structure of the reform, of the way the institutions are working. I have probably some house cleaning to mention that probably will require the attention of the authorities in the future. One will be the design of the market by itself. I mean, no market is perfect, and certainly going forward in the future, this might have to be tricky or adjust to realities that come about in the future that are difficult to identify today. So I just want to mention that the authorities will have to be flexible and recognize challenges or mistakes that might have been done with the design that we have today. And the second one has to do with the auction design. The design of the auctions that is done today, I mean, they have been very successful, extremely successful, I would say, from the side of the CFE. We should mention that the CFE that is buying is one of the subsidiaries that Tom was mentioning just now, is the subsidiary of Mercado Básico, or basic users, I'm sorry. And that's very important because that's a market that is regulated, which has the benefit of having the regulated tariffs, and secured volumes of energy sales in the future for this division of CFE, which is very nice. It's like a monopoly within a competitive market. And probably that was not the intention, but that's certainly what it looks like. And so that's interesting. Going forward, will be interesting to see who other participants can be designing and participating as auctioneers of volumes of energy or buyers of energy that they can buy from the market through an auction, besides CFE as the basic users. No? And the other one has to do with corporate governance. That's an issue that probably will have to be addressed in the short term, from my point of view. It doesn't make sense, and it's not helpful to have the same individual, who, by the way, I don't know if he's still present here, but who just spoke 5 minutes ago, which is the Secretary of Energy in Mexico, being the president of the SENACE, the president of CFE, the president of the Senagas, and the COFETER, and the CRE, Comisión Reguladora de Energía. It's not that has to be changed, because you cannot have an independent system operator who has as president the same individual who is the president of the elephant in the room in the energy market, which is CFE. And that has to be changed going forward, I guess. I'm sure that this is something that is being looked at, because it doesn't make sense that it is that way, especially if we wanted to be an independent of system operator as an ISO, not only on name but on reality. And I'm not saying that that's not the case today. I want to make very, very clear about that. But I think that in terms of market design, that has to be addressed going forward. And some of the issues that we are facing right now going forward has to do with energy challenges in financing. I guess we can address that in the following discussion that we have. It's not easy to finance projects under the auction. Let me tell you, basically because the prices are so low in this competitive market, that in order to get financing with so low prices, it is really difficult to get the leverages you're trying to achieve, mainly because you do not get the coverage ratios required in order to be able to get the financing that you might need. You might have designing your financial models. As everybody knows, in Excel, everything looks very nice, no? When you go to the reality and go into the bankers and negotiate, well, you know that table no longer works very well. So those are going to be very good challenges, and that's where we are today. I guess that those are my initial comments.
Okay, thank you very much, José Antonio. I would like to ask Tom if you can tell us what's happening with CFE. Now it has become a productive state entity, no longer an organismo público descentralizado or decentralized independent agency, and is being restructured. What can you tell us about the status of that?
That's right. By statutory mandate, CFE is undergoing a restructuring and unbundling process, which has not been concluded. It's still in progress. As I briefly mentioned, new subsidiaries were created for each type of activity along the supply or production chain. 6 generation subsidiaries. One of them, CFE Generación 5, specializes in generation through IPPs, through grandfathered plants, and represents them in the wholesale market. That one has a distinct role in comparison with the other subsidiaries. Then new transmission and distribution subsidiaries have also been created to continue providing the public service, because just as a parenthesis, prior to this reform, the generation, transmission, distribution, commercialization, and supply of energy were considered public services. Now, post-reform, only transmission, distribution, and basic supply are considered public services. And then new supply and commercialization subsidiaries and affiliates have been created. They were created on March 29th, 2016, and each of them mirrors the corporate governance structure of CFE. CFE has 10 board members, 5 of whom are appointed by the federal government, the chairman of which is the Minister of Energy, as Jose Antonio was mentioning, and the Minister of Finance also participates in the board, and as I will mention in a moment, that reflects the Ministry of Finance's constant involvement in the power industry and the energy industry as a whole. And one union representative and 4 independent directors. And right now, CFE is in the process of assigning its generation, transmission, distribution, basic supply, commercialization, and procurement permits to each of its subsidiaries. This must happen by October the 31st and December the 31st with respect to generation, and they must also assign, CFE must also assign its contracts for these activities to its new subsidiaries. And one last point is that CFE debt is no longer guaranteed by the Mexican state, as was the case pre-reform, but CFE may still, on a case-by-case basis, guarantee the obligations of each of its subsidiaries. But subsidiaries are jointly and severally liable for CFE debt. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Talking about CFE, what can you tell us, Dr. Rosellón, in how do the Mexican authorities plan to limit CFE's dominant power and try to make sure that they play nice in the sandbox?
Okay, so as I was mentioning, and also Tom was mentioning, the 2 crucial issues are horizontal integration in generation, as well as the issue of vertical integration, which poses access problems to the grid. So focusing firstly on the first issue, horizontal integration in generation, yes, I think it is crucial that these plants of CFE in practice work as different companies and really compete against each other and also in fair terms to the entrants. There is any regulatory economics book would tell you that there is a potential problem of collusion among the generation subsidiaries and also vertically speaking too. So that's, I think, one of the main challenges. We are hearing that this year they're working hard to have this separation among firms, CFE's generation plants. But it remains to be seen how this is going to work in practice. Of course, there is the other problem that if this is achieved, then there's still, a problem of having a dominant incumbent, and then that's why the CRE is also regulating the prices of generation. This is supposed to be a contestable market in the future, but right now, when it is being built, then there is still the problem of having the CRE, the regulator, regulating the tariffs or the generation prices from the CFE plants. And the other issue here in generation is how to really make this market operate when there are really, enough competition. We were hearing from the Energy Ministry Secretary that some private investors are already in the market, but when there is real competition, one really needs to see how this is going to work in the spot, the one day ahead market, and the capacity long-term market, and also under the existence of all the schemes like the IPP scheme and self-supply and schemes that they have the option of migrating from the current PPAs they have with CFE to the market. So in generation, I would see that problem. So I think the Mexican government is aware of these issues, but the challenge is to see how this is going to work in practice. And talking about vertical integration, well, the idea there, as I see it, again, I want to stress that I'm an independent member of SENACE, that the challenge there is to see how the expansion of the network really works out, and these auctions for private investors works out, and also how the access in practice is really fair for all the participants in the market. And finally, the other issue is, as I was mentioning before, at least from an academic point of view, there is this threat of having CFE carrying out in the market for final users some strategic behavior in terms of cross-subsidizing between the market for small consumers and large consumers, and then the role of retailers, of marketers, is really important to deal with those issues. Again, I think what I have heard is that the government is really aware of these problems, but I think these are not easy problems to resolve in practice.
Thank you, Juan. José Antonio, what can you tell us about the challenges to finance renewable energy projects in Mexico in order to achieve a favorable financial closing?
Yeah, well, as I was mentioning in my opening remarks, and everybody can raise their hand as to say, when have you seen a model in Excel that doesn't make money? I mean, raise your hand. No, that never happens, no? So one of the biggest challenges is that when you win, I mean, let me tell you a little bit of experience here. Once you win your auction and you are granted and you sign your PPA with the CFE and everything looks nice, you go to the banks, no? And say, listen, I had my PPA here and it's financiable and everything. Yeah, what is the price? No? That's the first thing they ask you, because they say, well, that looks very nice. It's a very financial price, a very financial PPA. But then, are you going to make money or not out of that? So that's the first tough question. Because if you see the questions, I mean, the average prices of the last auction, including solar, wind, and some the combined cycle, very small combined cycle, by the way, which was basically excess capacity from Tractebel in Tampico. We're talking about prices that are around $34 per megawatt hour. That is, I know for Texas prices that is high. I understand that ERCOT has very competitive pricing, but that is very low in the rest of the world. No? So it's not only the case of Mexico, but that tends to be challenging. And then you have to be very creative here as to how you address the financing. One of the clear solutions is that some of the winners have the very deep pockets, so they finance internally the projects. They go down here and they take the money out and they finance the project, and probably their expectations of returns are very low. And that is the at least the vox populi that is going on in the market in Mexico. That there are some large utilities from Italy or some other countries, I'm not mentioning names, of course, here, but that basically have a very low expectation of return, and they can and they have large powers of acquisition of equipment and assets that they can do. They can be very, very competitive in pricing their projects. So that is number one. The other one is that once you go to the markets, the financial markets, they tend to look at exactly what you're selling. You're selling cells, you're selling energy. That's a fixed price that goes in dollars, so that's a very stable stream of revenues. But you are renewable. How do I know you're going to be generating the energy you said you're going to be selling? And that is the biggest challenge here, because many companies, and I don't know this for certain, but I'm sure that they go with the highest probability of generation they can have in their valuation of the plant's capacity to generate electricity. And I don't want to go to technical here, but this goes to a P50 valuation. P50 means that they have the highest outcome of energy they can get in a year. They put it as their base case in the financial model. Of course, the banks will not buy that. And that's something that companies need to be very aware of, because if you go with a P50, that's the probability 50% of generation. But when you go with your highest curve, they will challenge that. And that's going to be very difficult to change. And then the coverage ratio will have to be the leverage is going to have to go down, not to the level that you have in your financial model, probably significantly down, in order to be able to bring that capacity, the coverage ratios not to 1.2 or 1.3 like is the usual in project finance, but probably to levels according to 150, 160. I have seen banks that are looking for 1.5 DCRCs, their debt service coverage ratios of 1.5 to your capacity of generation capacity. So that's a big challenge. That's the biggest challenge you have. And for example, for us, that we are selling now capacity in the same plant that won in the first auction is the same plant that is now selling capacity. Well, that's a positive because we have a higher revenue. But the truth is that the banks are not going to take that revenue as one-to-one, basically. They're going to say, no, we want to take that revenue probably at a 50% basis. Why? Because if we don't deliver the capacity, and I was mentioning the formula to define what capacity means on a yearly basis is well defined, but the capacity changes every year. I mean, the is basically based on a. You can explain that better, probably, Juan, than I do, but it's not very easy to understand. Anyways, since you are having to deliver capacity and you're in renewable energy, most probably there will be certain years in which you will not be able to deliver that capacity. So you need to do either you lower your expectations of revenue, or you have to create a reserve account for that capacity. So that's also another challenge. So the good news is that there is money. I mean, the banks in Mexico and the banks who are coming to Mexico to finance these projects have deep pockets today, and they're very much willing to finance. At least until this second auction, I have not seen any banks telling me, no, we cannot take more risks from Mexico or from CFE or from you. I have not seen that happen, but probably that might happen in the future, so that's something to take into consideration. And also, there are certain aspects of financing that have not been taken advantage of. And I'm talking about here directly on the addressing financing from other sources besides banks, issuing bonds, for example. That has not happened, but for projects for new projects, for greenfield projects, that is more usual to see with projects that are already operating, like the Acciona projects that they did a placement of $200 of I don't know how many $1 million. We were two placements in 2013. And there was a placement in December of last year from Santander, from Piedra Larga, who was a very interesting placement. So those are two alternatives that have not been very tapped directly, that probably will need to be addressed in the future.
Okay, Jose Antonio, now that we're talking about this very exciting financing topic, can you tell us how the bank evaluate the risk of the off-takers in the long-term auctions?
Well, the off-taker, as you know, is CFE. So, I mean, as I mentioned, as of today, CFE is still considered to be as a strong partner, a strong off-taker. And so the spreads that we have, that I'm seeing today in the market for such an off-taker are between the 210 basis points up to certain banks, smaller, I should mention, to 260. So the spread is quite large. The difference is large in the spreads, but the biggest banks are willing to take the risk with a low spread. So that's interesting to see. The coverage are basically, the average coverage is 125 to 135. I would say 130 you can say is the coverage. So that's fine. And the level of leverage is the usual. Well, you always start with 25. It probably can go up depending on your structure, and it can go down if your structure is solid and your capacity to generate energy is also solid. I mean, for those of you who understand more or less the curves of generation in wind energy, which is what I do, we do our offers in P90, for example. So we have a good coverage ratio. We have our leverage can go very high, but certain projects go to P50, and instead of going up, they have to go down in the leverage of financing.
Thank you. Tom, we will know formally next week who are the winners of the second long-term auction. Regarding the first long-term auction, what can you share with us, like the lessons learned from that first long-term auction by Senasa?
First of all, there were technical difficulties during the bid because there was an incorrect bid by one participant that required the recalculation of the auction optimization function. And then this in turn changed the universe of winning bids and companies. And then another criticism that was made was the very low prices of the bids, ranging from $22 to $67 per megawatt hour, on average $45 per megawatt hour. And that, as Jose Antonio was mentioning, has raised concerns with banks with respect to the bankability of some of these projects, where bidders bid too low to secure contracts. Companies such as Enel from Italy, which I understand is partly owned by the Italian state. And the point there is that these types of companies do not necessarily seek the revenues and profits most private companies would when answering to their shareholders. And that's low even compared to the prior lowest observed in Peru, which was a range of $47 to $80 per megawatt hour earlier this year. And then another issue was that to make their bids more competitive, according to some of the bidders who won contracts, they had the possibility to artificially bring down their capex in order to crunch the final price of their bids.
Okay. Juan, how is the Mexican government looking at nodal pricing, FTRs, and tariff subsidies?
Okay, so I would say first that yes, we come from a scheme where there usually, or I mean, many years of having a subsidized tariff scheme. So the prices were determined with a not so clear, obscure way, I would say, of establishing prices. The subsidies, we have done some studies at CIDE and found that basically define a regressive scheme, so that they didn't make much sense on how they were used. They were very high. And now I understand that the plan of the government is going all the way to a nodal pricing regime, which sounds easy. It's easy to say it, but in many countries, especially in Europe, where I have also been doing some research, going to a nodal pricing regime is really something hard. So in Mexico, the decision of going for nodal prices that determines the supply and demand conditions in each of the nodes, and also the shadow price of congestion, as economists say, it's, I think, a good start. So these nodal prices, precios marginales locales, locational marginal prices, are already published in the SENACE webpage. And then the idea is that we will see price differentials. We are seeing price differentials in the system. And FTRs are going to play a role in hedging consumers from these price differentials. So the plan for financial transmission rights is to use them initially as hedges that cover these price differential risks, and then also the way to implement the FTR market is firstly to granting initially some, they call it legacy FTRs or grandfather FTRs. And of course, this has, again, from an academic point of view, distributional impacts, because that will define the initial distributional status among the market players. And from then the auctioning of FTRs will be implemented through, various. The idea is to have in the future, not this year, probably next year, a market of FTRs with auctioning. And then, after designing all this price system, nodal price system, FTR markets, then the idea is to redefine subsidies in a progressive way. So we heard a question and an answer from the secretary today, that he was mentioning that Hacienda, the Minister of Finance of Mexico, is determining the final prices, determining subsidies, but the idea would be to grant subsidies in a progressive way, so to people that really needs it, and not the other way around. So here I of course see a problem of institutional problem, which is that the CNR and CRE, CENACE might have some objectives in mind, and Hacienda might have other objectives in reality. But yes, that would be the general question, the general answer here.
Well, the Mexican electricity market was modeled primarily after PJM, and seems like things are working well. But I would like from each of you, in 1 minute, before we open it for questions from the audience, in 1 minute each, starting from that end with you, Juan, what is your outlook for the Mexican electricity market starting tomorrow? So,
well,
the short term, the short and medium term outlook.
Well, I think firstly, I think the rules are in place, but I wouldn't say that we really have a market right now. I mean, it's just like CFE as an incumbent really adjusting to the new rules. And right now, the critical issue is that this big player is really, put into place and being regulated, and that the market really works out under this dominant incumbent. So I would say that in this year, probably the next one, the idea is to make sure that this happens and that the private investors that come really play under a level playing field. So I would say that would be the goal during this couple of years, and then when the private investors start to really come into I'm talking about the market for large users in the generation market, then we will start to see real competition. And in the case of PJM and other Northeast markets, it took them a while to really, have a mature market. So this is a long process, I would say. But during the next few years, I would say, as opposed to these markets that are more open than ours, that the first years is really to make sure that CFE operates under fair terms for private participants.
Thank you, Juan. Tom?
Yes. These changes cannot occur overnight. We're in a process, in a transition to a mature and fully competitive market, which will take a couple of years at least. For example, as my colleagues have been mentioning, the only off-taker in these first auctions has been CFE. So we will, or at least we hope to gradually see more private participants in the wholesale market particularly as off-takers, and more activity in qualified supply and bilateral transactions between qualified suppliers and qualified users, then from 2019 onwards, financial transmission rights will begin to be traded on the wholesale market. And then the second phase of the market still needs to be implemented, which, in accordance with the electricity market rules, will occur between 2017 and 2018, when the hour-ahead market will begin to operate. And then, as I was mentioning with respect to the restructuring of the CFE, several things still need to occur during this year, including the transfer of generation, transmission, distribution, supply, commercialization permits, and registries from CFE to its new subsidiaries, as well as the respective contracts for each of these activities. So we're still in a transition phase, which will hopefully consolidate by the end of this decade.
Thank you, Tom. Jose Antonio, what is your outlook for the market and in general for the electricity sector?
Well, I think that what was mentioned just a few minutes ago is very important. I think that everybody, my peers here talk about competition, and I think that's the key word here in this market. We need to really foster and promote competition. And I would like just to give an example of, just an idea. This is an example, an idea that might work in order to be able to really have more participants in the market. Today we have basically as the biggest, the most important players in this market, not only of the off-takers and generators, but also what is called the figura de suministradores, the traders of energy, or the deliverables. So how do you call that in English?
Suppliers.
The suppliers of energy. So in order to have, right now we don't have many private suppliers in Mexico, and the ones that we have are really trading very low volumes of energy. So one idea that I have is something that probably David Madero, who's going to be speaking in a few minutes from now, who is in Senagas, can give us an example as to what's going on in the gas market, because that's very interesting. In the gas market, we had a very big player. The only player in Mexico, basically, who was PGPB, or Pemex Gas, y Petroquímica Básica. And that company had, for many, many years, all of the contracts of the delivery of natural gas in Mexico on a bundled service to the largest users in Mexico. What is going on today, and correct me if I'm wrong here, David, is that all of those contracts are being taken away from PGPB. And then they're giving away, the user now will have no contract, secure contract of delivery they have security on the delivery of gas, but the person who can deliver that gas is a comercializador. So that person, that gives the opportunity for other participants to take that contract and sign a new contract with that user. So that way, these contracts who are in the hands of the biggest of PGPB are put in the market, and if there are traders who are very smart and capable, will take those contracts and have the capacity themselves, and they be the ones who will be delivering that energy at different prices, competitive prices, to the end user. In the electricity market, we're not doing that. We basically live in CFE, create different companies, and they're going to be competitive among themselves. And there's also a figure of private comercializadores, but the contracts are still in the hands of CFE. And you still need to be as a comercializador. You still have to go, or suministrador, I'm sorry. You still have to go to the end user and basically steal that user from CFE. And that's challenging because, if there is an end user who is getting this energy from CFE and is comfortable and say, why do I want to shake the tree? Why do I want to do that? And I think that what's going on in the gas market is very smart. And I'm saying PGPB is not basically losing. PGPB can sign again. Let's say we break this contract, but right here in the next table, I have another one, similar contract to the one we just broke. So this gives an opportunity of CFE to Pemex to also compete in the market. They're giving away they're releasing the capacity, but they can sign it again at a competitive price, and they have to compete in the market. So that's something that probably is an idea that probably could be used in the electricity market. I don't know, Dr. Rosellón, if you agree with that, but that's probably an idea that will probably bring more competitors, more participants, to the market, and then bring real competition into it.
Thank you, José Antonio. Well, we have time before we go to a break, for a 15-minute break. We have time for a couple of questions. If someone has a question, just please come over to the microphone. Thank you.
Good morning. Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. Alma del Toro from Blue Bull Energy, and you touched a little bit on the subject, but I'm interested in learning a little bit more, if you can share more, about the virtual trading. I know the platform is being built to get ready about 2018, but I'm curious to understand what ISO name would you be using? Is it like PGM? And historical data, would this be public? Is it for the whole country? Is it by region?
Is this a question for José Antonio?
No,
or for
I don't know the answer to that.
Of Juan?
I don't know.
Subject, and I know it's evolving, so I was curious if there was any information available.
Well, the only virtual trading I'm aware of, I was discussing with José Antonio this morning about certain private off-takers doing bidding online to purchase electricity. So, but if you want to, I guess, what's the name of your company? Blue Bell Energy?
Blue Boom.
Blue Boom. Okay. Moon. Ah, okay. Blue Bull. Okay. Okay. So we can talk. Yes, we can talk after the break. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Any other questions before we go to the break? Well, I guess let's give them a big round. Oh, Rebecca, please. Of course. How are you?
Good, thank you. I have a very quick question. In talking about encouraging competition beyond what CFE has done as the incumbent, can any of the panelists give me your thoughts on the current state of imports into Mexico from ERCOT, and whether you think that CFE Suministrador's activities there are hindering competition? Do you see that getting a little bit more open as they have recently resurrected over the last few months their daily auction process? Some folks are feeling that that might be hindering things.
Well, I would just have a general answer. I understand that, yes, there is a trading scheme or trading relationship with ERCOT, and that the data are open to see by anyone. I understand that right now we go from negative to a positive exchange with ERCOT, and also that the plans of the government are to increase the cross-border connections with ERCOT. In fact, I think the energy minister showed a slide on that. So, yes, I think the plans are to open up more the market, the trade relationships with Texas through more interconnections. I don't know if...
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. There are currently not that many interconnection points between ERCOT and the Mexican power grid, but the government has expressed plans to create more interconnection points and stimulate cross-border electricity trade, and eventually and gradually create a more integrated North American power market. So I think there are good medium-term opportunities in that regard.
And just to mention finally, there is, I believe, one of the suministradores that has been registered in Mexico who's actually doing that. They import electricity to Mexico and sell it to some users, to their own users, in Mexico. So that is already happening under the new law, by the way. And this is not something that comes from the La LESP, no, the old law in Mexico. So that's really something interesting. It makes all the sense in the world. The cheapest energy in the world is here in Texas, and to bring it down to Mexico is still very competitive, even with the wholesale prices we see in the auctions. For what I've seen, the ERCOT pricing is very, very low. So definitely that makes a lot of sense, and I will not be surprised to see that happening more, to have more liquidity in that market. I believe that there's a technical glitch that you need to convert the cycle of the energy. Because I believe one energy is at 60 cycles and one is at 50. So that's a technical glitch that is not cheap to do, but certainly that's something that can be overcome with large volumes of electricity.
And finally, I think there's a combined cycle in Texas that does send electricity to Mexico. I think it's Fisterra, and that's my recollection. Anybody else? Well, let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you very much.